The night the Vampire King's world cracked open began like every other night in the fortress of Weirmont Cold, elegant and merciless to the weak. High above the city, carved into a mountain of black stone, the royal castle glowed under a crimson moon, its towers wrapped in ancient magic and fear. Inside, nobles of pure vampire blood gathered for a ceremonial court, their whispers sharp with arrogance and hunger. This was a place where servants were shadows, and humans were tolerated only when useful. And yet, on this night, a single human girl poor, unnoticed, and trembling would step into history without meaning to, simply because she spoke the truth. Leora had lived her entire life trying not to be seen. She was the daughter of a palace maid, small for her age, with worn shoes and hands that carried the quiet scars of labor. While other children slept in warm beds, Leora often waited in service corridors, clutching her thin shawl as her mother worked long hours cleaning halls that would never belong to them. The castle was beautiful, yes, but it was not kind. Guards barked orders. Noble children laughed when servants passed. And Leora learned early that silence was safety. But curiosity, like kindness, has a way of breaking rules. That night, the castle buzzed with unusual tension. A rare royal assembly had been called, one that even veteran servants whispered about with fear. Leora had been told to stay in the lower quarters, but when she noticed her mother struggling with a heavy basket of linens meant for the upper halls, she followed quietly to help. Along the way, a wrong turn led her to a corridor she had never seen before, one glowing faintly with red runes that pulsed like a heartbeat. At the end of that corridor stood doors taller than any she had ever known, cracked open just enough for light and sound to spill through. Inside sat the vampire, king. He was not like the stories whispered by servants. He was worse and more. Tall, unmoving, carved from centuries of power and restraint, the king sat upon a throne of obsidian and iron, his presence bending the air around him. His eyes were not cruel, but distant, burdened by ages of rule and betrayal. Nobles feared him. Enemies prayed not to be remembered by him. And humans? Humans did not exist to him at all. Until that moment, Leora did not understand politics or bloodlines. She only saw something strange, something familiar. As the king lifted his hand to silence the court, a symbol burned faintly on his palm. A crimson mark, shaped like a crescent wrapped in thorns, glowing softly as if alive. Leora froze. Her heart began to race, not with fear, but recognition. She had seen that mark before, many times. On her mother's arm, when nightmares stole her sleep. When pain came without reason. When memories seemed to haunt her eyes. Without thinking, without permission, Leora stepped forward. Gasps rippled through the chamber as guards turned too late, their hands hovering near weapons. A human child had crossed sacred ground. The Vampire King's gaze fell on her at last, sharp and unreadable. The room held its breath. Leora's voice shook, but she did not stop. She pointed at his hand, then looked up at him with wide, honest eyes, and said the words that shattered centuries of certainty. "Sir, my mom has a mark just like yours." Silence fell so heavily it felt alive. Nobles stared. Guards stiffened. The king did not move. For the first time in decades, uncertainty flickered across his face. Slowly, he rose from his throne, his steps measured, dangerous. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, but edged with something unfamiliar. Leora swallowed hard. "It glows sometimes," she continued softly. "When she's scared, or when she dreams about fire." The mark on the king's palm flared brighter. Magic surged through the chamber, rattling stone and glass. Murmurs turned to panic. That symbol was ancient believed to exist only within the extinct royal bloodline. It could not belong to a human maid. It could not exist twice. And yet the magic did not lie. The king knelt before the child, shocking everyone present. He gently turned Leora's small hand upward. Beneath her skin, faint but undeniable, the same mark shimmered in echo, unfinished but real. A connection sparked between them, ancient and undeniable. The vampire king's breath caught. "Bring me her mother," he commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. Now, moments later, a terrified woman was dragged into the chamber. Leora's mother, pale, exhausted, her eyes filled with fear not for herself, but for her child. She begged. She knelt. She apologized for crying she did not understand. And then the king raised his hand toward her. The mark on her arm ignited in full, blazing crimson as memory's long-buried screamed to return. The castle trembled. The past clawed its way into the present. And the vampire king finally understood the impossible truth standing before him. The woman they had erased. The bloodline they failed to kill. And the child who would awaken everything. Asterisk as the crimson moon burned brighter above the castle. The vampire king realized that the weakest voice in the room had just changed the fate of his entire kingdom. Asterisk, the chamber remained sealed long after the first shock faded, yet the air inside felt thinner with every passing second, as if the castle itself was struggling to contain the truth that had been awakened. The nobles stood frozen in their places, fear tightening their faces, while the guards kept their weapons lowered but ready, sensing that one wrong move could trigger a catastrophe. At the center of it all stood the vampire king, his attention no longer on the court, but fixed entirely on the trembling woman before him and the small girl clinging desperately to her side. For the first time in centuries, power did not bring him certainty. It brought questions he had buried long ago. Leora's mother could barely stand. The crimson mark on her arm burned like living fire, pulsing in rhythm with the king's own seal. She tried to pull her sleeve back down, not out of shame, but fear. All her life she had hidden that mark, treating it like a curse she never understood. She had scrubbed floors, bowed her head, endured insults from nobles and cruelty from overseers, believing she deserved it because she was nothing more than a maid. Now the same mark that had brought her pain was dragging her into a world she had never been allowed to touch. The vampire king stepped closer, his voice softer, but no less commanding. He ordered the guards to lower their weapons and commanded the nobles to be silent. When he spoke again, it was not as a ruler addressing servants, but as a man facing a truth he had been denied. He asked the woman her name, her history, where she came from. Her answers were simple, broken, and incomplete. She remembered no childhood, no family before the castle, only fragments of fire, screaming, and someone telling her she must forget to survive. Each word tightened the king's jaw further. Leora watched silently, her small fingers wrapped around her mother's hand. She did not understand bloodlines or rebellions, but she understood fear. She had seen it in her mother's eyes many nights, after dreams that left her shaking. When the king finally looked at Leora again, his expression changed. He did not see a servant's child anymore. He saw a living echo of something ancient, something the kingdom believed had been destroyed. The High Council was summoned immediately. Ancient vampires stepped forward, their expressions dark with dread. They spoke in low, urgent tones, arguing over possibilities they had sworn were impossible. Some claimed it was forbidden magic, an illusion meant to deceive the throne. Others whispered a far more dangerous truth, that the royal bloodline had not been fully erased, that someone had lied, and that the consequences of that lie were now standing in the room. With every word spoken, the tension thickened, and the castle's magic responded, glowing faintly along the walls, like veins beneath skin. The vampire king listened, silent and unmoving. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet fury that silenced even the council. He declared that until the truth was uncovered, the woman and her child were under his direct protection. The words stunned the court. Protection was not given lightly, especially not to humans. Murmurs erupted, some filled with outrage, others with fear. But none dared challenge him openly. The king's authority was absolute, and the mark burning on his palm made it clear that ancient forces agreed with him. Yet protection came with a cost. Leora was gently but firmly taken from her mother's arms and escorted to a secure wing of the castle, one guarded by magic older than the walls themselves. She cried, calling out for her mother, her small voice echoing painfully through the halls. The vampire king watched her go, something heavy settling in his chest. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself it was for her safety. But the sound of her fear lingered long after the doors closed behind her. Left alone in the chamber, the woman collapsed to her knees. The weight of forgotten memories pressed against her mind like a storm threatening to break. The king knelt before her again, his tone no longer cold, but restrained, as if holding back something dangerous and fragile at the same time. He told her the truth as he knew it, that she bore the mark of the royal bloodline, that such a thing could not happen by chance, and that someone powerful had gone to great lengths to erase her identity. As the council debated in whispers, unseen eyes watched from the shadows beyond the sealed chamber. Messengers slipped through hidden passages, carrying news across mountains and borders to places where enemies waited patiently. Far away, in a fortress swallowed by darkness, another vampire listened to the report with interest and satisfaction. He had spent decades believing the past was buried forever. Now it was rising, and if the bloodline returned, it would threaten everything he had built. Back in the castle, the vampire king stood alone after dismissing the court. He stared at his glowing hand, then toward the distant wing where a frightened child sat guarded and alone. He had ruled through fear and strength for centuries, but neither had prepared him for this moment. Somewhere between the servant halls and the throne room, fate had shifted, and whether he wished it or not, the weakest lives in his kingdom were now tied directly to his own. As the sealed chamber finally fell silent, the vampire king understood one chilling truth: protecting the maid and her daughter might cost him his throne, but failing them would cost him his soul. Asterisk. The days that followed were unlike anything the castle of Weirmont had known in centuries. Whispers crawled through its corridors like living things, carried by servants who suddenly found themselves watched, questioned, and feared. The maid and her daughter, once invisible, had become the most dangerous secrets in the kingdom. Guards stood at every archway leading to the eastern wing, where Leora was kept under constant protection, surrounded by enchantments meant to shield her from harm. Yet no spell could quiet the child's fear. She woke crying each night, calling for her mother, her small heart sensing that something vast and frightening had been set into motion because of her words. Her mother, confined to a secure chamber nearby, felt that fear as if it were her own breath being stolen. She was treated with care now, given warm food, clean clothes, and deference that felt wrong, almost cruel in its suddenness. The same nobles who once ignored her gaze now avoided her entirely, afraid to meet her eyes. But comfort could not erase confusion. Every hour brought flashes of memories she could not fully grasp, shadows of halls she had never walked as a maid, voices that spoke her name with reverence, and a man whose face she could almost remember, standing in fire and blood. Calling her to run, the vampire king visited her chamber in silence one evening, dismissing his guards with a single gesture. When he entered, the room seemed to tighten around him, ancient magic responding to his presence. He did not sit on a throne now. He stood before her as an equal, or perhaps as someone afraid of what the truth might reveal. He asked her to describe the memories as they came, no matter how broken or painful. As she spoke, his expression darkened, not with anger, but with guilt. Every fragment confirmed what he had begun to suspect. Someone within the court had betrayed the bloodline from the inside. Meanwhile, Liara's isolation was tested in ways no child should endure. Servants sent to care for her were kind but distant, afraid to speak freely in a place thick with secrets. One night, when fear became too heavy to bear, Liara slipped past a distracted guard and wandered into the moonlit gardens. She had walked those paths before as a servant's child, unnoticed and ignored. Now the magic of the land reacted to her presence, flowers opening as she passed, stones glowing faintly beneath her feet. The garden itself seemed to recognize her dot. It was there the vampire king found her. He had followed the pull of ancient magic without realizing why until he saw the small figure standing beneath the crimson moon. For a long moment, neither spoke. The king felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not fear, not duty, but responsibility that went beyond his crown. He knelt before her, not as a ruler, but as someone trying to understand. Liara asked him in a small, trembling voice if her mother would be taken away forever. The question struck him harder than any blade. He promised her she would not be harmed. It was the first promise he had made in centuries, without calculating its political cost. Liara, sensing honesty rather than authority, did something no one else dared. She reached out and took his hand. The mark on his palm responded instantly, glowing brighter than it ever had before. Magic rippled outward, awakening symbols carved into the garden long before the current kingdom was built. The land recognized her touch as it recognized his. That moment did not go unnoticed. Far from Weirmont, in the fortress of black stone where the sun never rose, Prince Kale, the king's long-exiled kin, felt the surge of power through the blood. He smiled, slow and dangerous. The prophecy he had tried to erase was unfolding despite his efforts. If the child fully awakened, she would become a symbol no army could silence. He ordered his agents to move. The girl must be taken. The woman must be silenced. And the king, blinded by guilt and sentiment, would fall by his own mercy. Back in the castle, the vampire king convened the council again, this time behind wards that even spies could not penetrate. He announced that an investigation would begin, one that would tear through the court until the traitor was revealed. The council resisted, warning of instability, rebellion, and fear. He ignored them. For the first time, his decisions were not driven by preservation of power, but by the need to correct a wrong that had cost innocent lives decades of suffering. That night, assassins breached the outer defenses. Silent, precise, and deadly, they moved toward the eastern wing with purpose. Alarms rang too late. Guards fell. Magic clashed against darker magic born of Forbidden's blood rites. The vampire king reached Liara's chamber just as a blade flashed from the shadows. He moved without thought, shielding her with his body. The blade struck him instead, burning with poison meant for royal blood dot as he fell to one knee. Liara screamed, the sound ripping through the castle like a call to war. The mark on her hand flared fully for the first time, unleashing a wave of power that threw the attackers back in terror. Walls cracked. Torches exploded. The castle shook as ancient forces awakened to protect their rightful blood dot as the vampire king bled on the stone floor, and the child's power erupted in fear and fury. It became clear that the past had not only returned, it had chosen its protector. The castle of Weirmont did not sleep after the attack. Torches burned through the night, alarms echoed across towers, and wounded guards were carried through corridors stained with shadow and blood. The vampire king survived the poisoned blade, but only because the magic bound to his blood refused to let him fall. Even so, the injury left him weakened in a way no enemy had achieved in centuries. He was taken to a sealed chamber where ancient healers worked in silence. their faces tight with fear, knowing the attack was not random but deliberate. Someone had dared to strike at the throne through a child. Leora was locked in shock. She sat beside her mother, trembling, unable to understand why her voice had become a weapon or why the castle itself had answered her fear. Her mother held her tightly, whispering comfort she barely believed herself. The memories inside her continued to stir, growing sharper with each surge of magic. Faces gained names. Places gained meaning. And slowly, painfully, she began to remember who she had been before the night fire raced her life. As the vampire king regained strength, he ordered the castle sealed from within. No noble was allowed to leave. No messenger was permitted to fly. Fear rippled through the court, not only because of the assassination attempt, but because the king's silence had become more frightening than his anger. When he finally emerged, pale but steady, his presence alone commanded attention. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply announced that a traitor existed among them, and that the ancient laws would be invoked. Those laws had not been used in generations, and their return carried the weight of judgment no one wished to face. The woman, once known as a maid, stood beside him during the assembly, her posture uncertain, but her gaze steady. She was no longer hidden. The mark on her arm glowed openly now, no longer something to be concealed. The nobles recoiled, some in fear, others in disbelief. The vampire king spoke the truth aloud, that she was of the bloodline thought destroyed, that her memories had been stolen by forbidden magic, and that the court itself had allowed the lie to stand. Gasps followed. Accusations flew. Old alliances cracked under the pressure of truth. That night, as storms gathered over the mountain, the woman's memories finally broke free. She remembered her real name. She remembered being dragged through fire, ordered to forget, and spared only because someone believed erasing her was safer than killing her. She remembered loving the man who now stood as king, not as a ruler, but as someone who once swore to protect her. The realization shattered her. She was no longer just a victim of cruelty. She was a survivor of betrayal. Leora sensed the shift in her mother before any words were spoken. The child, once quiet and fearful, had begun to change. She no longer flinched at guards or hid behind doors. The magic within her responded to emotion, blooming when she felt love, anger, or fear. The vampire king watched her carefully, understanding now that her power was not destructive by nature. It was protective. It responded to injustice the way fire responds to air. And that made her dangerous to those who thrived on cruelty. Far beyond the castle, Prince Kale prepared his final move. He had underestimated the child's awakening, but he would not make the same mistake again. He rallied those loyal to him with promises of power and fear of extinction. If the bloodline returned fully, his claim would vanish. The kingdom would remember who he truly was. And so, under the cover of storm and shadow, his forces moved toward Weirmont, intent on taking the child and ending the woman once and for all. The attack came at dawn. Dark creatures poured through the mountain passes, magic clashing against the castle's ancient wards. The vampire king stood at the battlements, no longer hesitating. He ordered civilians evacuated, servants protected, and the child kept close. But when the gates began to fail, Leora stepped forward, her small hand slipping into his. She looked up at him, not with fear, but resolve. She told him the castle would not fall, not if he trusted her. Against every instinct, he did. Together, they stood as the storm broke. Leora raised her hand, and the ground beneath the invaders turned against them. Walls repaired themselves. Light burst from ancient sigils long dormant. The kingdom answered its rightful blood. From the chaos, the woman stepped forward. Her memories whole at last, her power returning not as a weapon, But as Prince Kale's forces retreated in disbelief, the Vampire King realized the greatest threat was no longer the enemy outside, but the reckoning that must follow within as dawn broke over a battered but standing kingdom. The Vampire King understood that the child he had sworn to protect had become the shield that would decide the fate of them all. The kingdom did not celebrate its survival. When the sun rose over Viremont, it revealed cracked towers, scorched stone, and faces marked not with victory, but realization. The people had seen the truth with their own eyes. They had watched a child protect a throne that had never protected her. They had seen a woman, once forced to scrub floors, stand unbroken before armies. And they had seen their immortal king bleed for someone the court had spent years pretending did not exist. Power had shifted, not with ceremony, but with consequence. The Vampire King called for a full gathering not of nobles alone, but of servants, guards, and citizens who had sheltered within the lower halls during the attack. It was unheard of. The great chamber filled with people who had never before been allowed to stand beneath its vaulted ceiling. Leora stayed close to her mother, her small fingers laced tightly with hers, while the king stood before them without armor or crown. When he spoke, his voice carried across the room not his command, but confession. He acknowledged the failure of the throne, the lie of extinction, and the cruelty allowed to grow in silence. Each word struck harder than judgment. The woman stepped forward when he finished. For years she had been nameless to them, invisible and expendable. Now she spoke with calm strength, not demanding revenge, not asking for power, but naming the pain that had been ignored. She spoke of being erased, of raising a child in fear, of watching cruelty go unpunished while kindness went unseen. She did not accuse. She simply told the truth. And in that truth, the court felt shame for the first time in generations. Justice followed swiftly. Members of the High Council were stripped of rank when evidence of their complicity surfaced. Those who had known and stayed silent were exiled. Those who had acted were imprisoned under ancient law. The kingdom watched as instant karma unfolded, not through spectacle, but through fairness that could no longer be delayed. Servants whispered in disbelief as nobles who once mocked them were escorted out in chains of cold iron. The message was clear. The age of cruelty protected by silence was ending, yet the greatest trial remained. Prince Kale had not been defeated, only driven back. His shadow still loomed beyond the mountains, and his claims still threatened the fragile peace forming within the kingdom. The Vampire King knew that waiting would only invite another war. He chose to act, not alone, but with those he now trusted most. He revealed the final truth. The woman standing beside him was not only of royal blood, she was the rightful queen by lineage. And Leora, her daughter, was the living bridge between power and humility that prophecy had foretold. The room erupted. Some fell to their knees. Others wept. A few fled in fear. The woman staggered under the weight of it, shaking her head, insisting she had never wanted a throne. The king met her gaze, his expression soft but unwavering. He told her the throne had never been about desire, but responsibility, and that she had carried that burden quietly for years without recognition. He did not ask her to rule. He asked her to stand with him. That night, as the kingdom prepared for what might come, Leora sat with the Vampire King on the high balcony overlooking the city. She asked him why people were cruel to those they believed weak. He answered honestly that fear often hides behind power, and that those who fear kindness the most try hardest to destroy it. Leora listened, then told him she did not want to be feared. She wanted people to feel safe. The simplicity of her wish struck him deeper than any prophecy beyond the mountains. Prince Kale watched the kingdom glow with renewed magic. He knew then that killing the child would not be enough. The people had seen. The lie was broken. Even if he won the war, he would rule ashes. Rage twisted into desperation as he prepared one final act, one meant not to conquer, but to destroy everything the bloodline represented. Back in Weirmont, the woman stood alone before the ancient mirror of the throne room, seeing not a servant, not a queen, but a survivor. The vampire king joined her, placing the crown not on her head, but in her hands. He told her the choice was hers, and that whatever she chose, he would protect her and the child with his life. She closed her eyes, thinking of years lost, of pain endured, and of a future that could finally be different. As the woman lifted her head and made her choice, the kingdom held its breath, knowing that the final reckoning was no longer a matter of fate, but of courage. The final reckoning did not come with thunder alone. It came with silence first, the kind that settles before history is rewritten. Weirmont stood ready, not with fear, but with resolve that had been forged through truth instead of illusion. The people no longer waited behind locked doors or bowed their heads in silence. Servants stood beside guards. Humans stood beside vampires. And at the heart of the kingdom stood a woman who had once been erased, holding the hand of a child who had awakened everything that had been buried. Prince Kael arrived at dusk, cloaked in shadow and fury, leading the remnants of his forces toward the gates he once believed would fall without resistance. But the wards did not break this time. They opened. The vampire king walked forward alone, unarmed, his presence commanding attention without threat. Behind him stood the woman and Leora, not hidden, not protected by distance, but visible to all. It was not a challenge of strength. It was a challenge of truth. Kael laughed when he saw them. He called the woman a mistake and the child a curse. He accused the king of weakness, of betraying his kind by protecting what was fragile. The vampire king listened without interruption. When Kael finished, the king spoke calmly, naming every crime Kael had committed, every life erased, every lie told in the name of power. The people listened. The magic listened. And when Kael denied it, the child stepped forward. Leora did not raise her voice. She did not summon fire or force. She simply placed her hand on the stone beneath her feet. The ground responded, revealing memories Kael had tried to destroy, visions of betrayal, executions, and erased lives projected into the air like living truth. The crowd watched as the past unfolded unfiltered. Kael screamed, trying to silence it, but the magic no longer answered him. It answered her. The woman spoke next, her voice steady despite the pain of remembering. She did not curse Kael. She did not demand revenge. She declared that the bloodline would no longer rule through fear, nor erase those who stood in the way. Justice would replace cruelty. Choice would replace domination. And the child, her daughter, would never be used as a weapon, but as a promise that the weak would no longer be invisible. Kael attacked in desperation, striking not at the king, but at the child. He never reached her. The vampire king moved without hesitation, shielding her with his body as the woman stepped forward and ended the conflict with authority rooted in truth, not violence. Kael fell, not defeated by force, but stripped of power by the very lies he had built his rule upon. His supporters fled. His shadow dissolved. The prophecy was fulfilled not through destruction, but through exposure. When the dust settled, the kingdom did not erupt in cheers. Instead, it exhaled. The vampire king knelt before the woman, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. He asked her to rule with him, not above the people, but among them. She accepted, not as a queen defined by blood, but as one defined by endurance. And Leora, standing between them, smiled, not because she had won, but because no one was afraid anymore. In the days that followed, laws changed. Servants were given voice. Humans were given protection. Power was measured not by fear, but by responsibility. The vampire king soft not through words, but through action. He listened. He learned. And slowly, love grew not rushed, not spoken, but built through trust, respect, and shared purpose. Leora returned to the gardens where it had all begun, running freely beneath a sky no longer crimson with threat. The kingdom watched her with hope instead of suspicion. She had not been born powerful. She had been born kind. And in the end, that kindness had changed everything. As the kingdom entered a new age, the world learned the truth it would never forget, that real power is not born from fear, but from protecting those who were once powerless.